Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Child in Time, Growing Up in the 60s. I'm Scott, and this time I'm going to be talking about movies from the 1960s. Some of my favourites. Each one is a classic, and these are films that stand up to repeated viewings. You know, a great film will never let you down. Watch it 20 years after you first see it, and your favourite scenes will still be there. And in this age of streaming, all the films I'm going to talk about are relatively easy to access. So here we go. Now, these films are in no particular order. This is not a countdown or anything. And please don't worry. There are no obscure 4-hour foreign language cinema verite opuses that you have to pretend to understand. No, nothing here is hard to find. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the original West Side Story, made in 1961. Of course, it's based on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, set in a modern-day setting in New York. It won 10 Oscars, back in the time where the Oscars actually meant something. The soundtrack of the film was the number one album in the USA for 54 weeks. I can't count how many times I've watched this musical. And of course, like Romeo and Juliet, it's a tragedy. But the iconic songs, the dancing, the energy, it's just wonderful. Watch it on a big screen if you can, not on your phone. I rushed out to see the Spielberg remake in 2021, and while it's not bad, watch the original, please. And to New York listeners and others, some of West Side Story was filmed in the long-demolished tenement housing near Columbus Circle. On that site now is the Lincoln Center for Performing Arts, the Avery Fisher Hall, and places like that. So next we're going to the very end of the decade for the 1969 film, Easy Rider. It was produced and directed and starred Peter Fonda and Dennis Hopper. It's a road film about two bikers or bikies travelling through the south of the USA after completing a drug deal. It really captures the zeitgeist, the counterculture with the drug use and rebellion. And it's a film for all the family. Not. It also has a great soundtrack with the likes of Steppenwolf and Jimi Hendrix and others. And it was made on a shoestring budget of $400,000, but made $60 million at the box office. And the film really kick-started the new wave of Hollywood directors in the early 70s. Jack Nicholson plays a supporting role midway through the film, and he almost steals the whole thing. And as I've said in a previous episode, when the film was released in Australia, 13 minutes were cut. Essentially, anything depicting drug use was out. Because I'm sure anyone who saw the film here in Australia would immediately rush out of the cinema and try and buy marijuana tablets or smoke LSD. Yeah, man. The guys arrive in New Orleans for Mardi Gras, where a large section towards the end of the film takes place. And then we have the final scene, which will live long in the memory. Some years ago, a mate and I drove across the USA from Florida to Los Angeles. By chance, and this was not planned, it was Mardi Gras in New Orleans when we got there. Whoa. To be honest, it was the only part of the trip when we felt a bit scared. Bourbon Street, which is the centre of the party action, was incredibly crowded with thousands of people who were well, shall we say, refreshed. He could not move. So, see Easy Rider again. It's a trip, man. Now to 1962 and the low-budget neo-noir horror film Carnival of Souls. It was made on a budget of $33,000, and it's really achieved cult status over the decades after it made no impact at all when it was initially released. The director, a guy called Herc Harvey, only made one film, but what an eerie, masterful film it is. In glorious black and white, the plot centres on Mary, played by Candice Hildegos. She's involved in a serious car accident, then attempts to settle in another city, but she is unable to mix with the people she meets. She is also drawn to an abandoned carnival pavilion. Now, that might not sound like much, but trust me, it is a film that will more than likely stay with you. My advice is not to watch it alone. Look, there's no blood or gore, so don't worry about that. But you'll see why it's often voted as one of the best films of its kind ever made. Sleep well. Of all the great 1960s westerns out there, I've chosen the epic spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly from 1966. Starring Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach, directed by the great Sergio Leone. It has the magnificent soundtrack by Ennio Morricone. Now, I bet you could hum the theme right now if I asked you to. Although it was an Italian production, Spain was where most of it was filmed. It's a tale of three gunslingers who help and hinder each other in the race to find hidden gold. Lots of violence, so not a film for the children, nor is it a date movie. I suppose you'd call it a boy's picture. Yeah, probably. Again, I urge you to watch it on the biggest screen you can find to fully enjoy the vistas and scope of the breathtaking landscape of Spain, pretending to be the Old West. Scott, I hear you say, lighten this up a bit. What about a comedy? Sure. Although 1963's The Pink Panther was done as an ensemble film, we all know it was the first appearance of Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau and the beginning of the Pink Panther franchise. Like many of the films I'm talking about here, initially the reviews for the film were mixed. But as time went on, its reputation grew. Peter Sellers steals and elevates the film, and along with director Blake Edwards, started a run of 7 Pink Panther films. I prefer the early films in the series. But Clouseau is great. Even now, after all these years, whenever I go to check into a hotel, I just want to go to the desk and say, "Do you have a room?" To 1967 and the comedy drama The Graduate. Dustin Hoffman, in his first movie role, plays opposite Anne Bancroft as Mrs. Robinson. It's a comedy and a drama, and it is one of the best films ever made. You really need to see it if you haven't already. It concerns a love affair between the college graduate and the older wife of family friends. And a lot of lines of the film, they've entered popular culture. The soundtrack from Simon & Garfunkel, that's perfect too. Bit of trivia. Anne Bancroft was barely 6 years older than Hoffman, so she was playing much older than she actually was, and he was playing much younger. Okay. Open the pod bay doors, Hal. You know where that line comes from, don't you? It's from Stanley Kubrick's sci-fi masterpiece, 2001, A Space Odyssey. It's regarded by many as one of the greatest films ever made, and I must have seen it 2001 times. No, not quite. It confounded many critics when it first came out. It's not your typical Hollywood fare. It's beautifully made and makes you think. I know as I go through this film and others, I'm conscious not to give too much away plot-wise. No spoilers. It reminds me when the film Titanic came out, we're in the foyer waiting to see it, and a guy from the previous session walks past me and says, "The ship sinks." Well, thanks for that. Back to 2001. I love each Stanley Kubrick film. But which part of 2001 is your favourite? There was a nod to 2001 in the opening scene of the Barbie film, but I wonder how many of the people who saw it got the reference. Now, we've got to have an Alfred Hitchcock film. A film with one of the most iconic scenes in movie history. Go on. Have a guess. If you said the shower scene from Psycho, well done. It is one of the most famous scenes in cinema history. The screeching violins that accompany it are just as iconic. It's hard not to give spoilers here as I talk about these films. But another thing to note is that the film's 109 minutes in length, and this is compared to a lot of the modern films that go on for 3 hours. Anyway, back to Psycho. Reviews were mixed when it came out, but it cemented its place as a classic horror film. But is it a horror film? Discuss. In 1962, James Bond made his cinema debut in Dr. No. Sean Connery played Bond in the first 7 films of the series, and a lot of people rate him as the best of all. Me? Well, it's a tie between Connery and Daniel Craig as to who's the best. Now, Daniel, I know you listen, but mate, you wouldn't have gotten the role unless Connery had established the franchise in the 1960s. The film is still a lot of fun after all these years. It sets the template for the Bond films that make it the most successful film franchise ever. Yes, it is. When I lived in London in the mid-70s, I would sometimes go to the movies in the morning. Once, for some reason, the cinema I attended gave numbered seat tickets for maybe about 30 people, and we all had to sit in our numbered seats, all clumped together, midway back in the middle, with the rest of the vast cinema was just empty. It was bizarre. Anyway, after the film, the guy sitting next to me, to my right, started talking to me. He looked familiar somehow. He told me he was an actor. The guy was Victor Spinetti, the only person to appear in all the Beatles films, including, of course, 1964's A Hard Day's Night. If you want to see what Beatlemania was all about, see the film. Okay, you know I'm a huge Beatles fan, so there is no way I'm not putting a Beatles film in here. It's still fresh, funny, and fantastic now. It's just great. Anyway, Victor Spinetti and I had a great chat about his good friends, the Beatles. So, see A Hard Day's Night again. Ooh, look at the time. Okay. Look, there are other 60s films I could have talked about, and maybe I will sometime. That would include Midnight Cowboy, Spartacus, Night of the Living Dead, The Great Escape, and that 1964 Stone Cold classic, Santa Claus Conquers The Martians. Just kidding. Talk soon.